The floor of the Bavarian forest shuddered beneath the heavy mechanical groan of diesel engines. It was April 14th, 1945. Above, the pines stood as black silhouettes against a sky bruised in shades of purple and iron gray, their branches swaying in a biting wind that carried the stench of cordite and smoldering timber. Beyond the tree line, the scream of artillery tore through the air, though the dense woodland muffled the distant detonations. The war in Europe was collapsing inward, imploding like a dying star. And every man still wearing the uniform of the Third Reich felt the end approaching in his very bones. These were no longer soldiers of conquest. They were merely survivors, clinging to orders that had lost all meaning, waiting for a finale they were powerless to control. Among the retreating masses, 60 men of the Waffen SS trudged through the underbrush. Their boots were heavy with mud, their faces gaunt and hollowed by exhaustion. For weeks they had been in retreat, their units fractured and their supply lines severed beyond repair. The grand, delusional visions of times, Lebensraum times, and an eternal empire had dissolved into the brutal calculus of immediate survival. Find food, evade capture, exist for one more day. These were not the same men who had once goose-stepped through the avenues of Paris or stood triumphant on the steppes of Ukraine. They were the ghosts of that army, haunted by the crushing realization that the world they had fought to forge was crumbling into ash around them. Through a small opening in the trees, they noticed someone standing on the narrow path, a lone individual, quietly waiting. His belongings were worn and uneven, clearly affected by the challenging journey, yet he remained calm and steady. He didn't call out or move aside. He simply stood there with a composed expression. For a moment, the entire group approaching the trail paused. Dozens of travelers found themselves facing a single person whose equipment no longer functioned as it should. The stillness of the scene felt unusual, almost surreal, and no one spoke. What happened next became one of the most quietly memorable moments of those final days. An encounter defined not by action, but by presence. It challenged assumptions and offered a rare glimpse into resilience, dignity, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. This event would haunt the memories of those who witnessed it, not for its violence, but for the profound absence of it. In that silent confrontation, something far deeper than ballistics passed between captor and captive, something that spoke to the very core of the war itself. To understand how one man, with a broken rifle, could compel 60 elite soldiers to lay down their arms, one must first understand the psychological landscape of Germany in that final spring. The Waffen SS, once the ideological vanguard of the regime, had been conditioned to believe in their own invincibility and their divine mandate to reshape the globe. They had been fed the lie that the Allies were weak, decadent, and corrupted by democracy. They were assured that German will and purity would inevitably triumph. By April, however, that narrative lay in shards. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were hammering at the gates of Berlin. German cities were reduced to ruins, their populations starving, their infrastructure obliterated. The men of the SS no longer believed in victory. Many no longer believed in anything at all. What remained was muscle memory, the habit of obedience, the reflex of hierarchy, and the ingrained terror of breaking formation. They were men caught between two fears, the fear of surrender and the fear of continuing a fight they had already lost. The American soldier identified in declassified reports as Private First Class Eugene Hartwell, though the official record remains frustratingly sparse, understood this intuitively. Hartwell had not stumbled upon the SS column by accident. separated from his unit during a skirmish 2 days prior. His M1 Garand had been damaged when he dove for cover behind a fallen oak, shearing off the firing pin and leaving the weapon as effective as a club. Yet, Hartwell did not discard it. He kept it slung across his back, its silhouette unmistakable, because he understood a fundamental truth of the theater of war. Perception is a weapon often more potent than steel. When he encountered the column, he did not see 60 enemies. He saw 60 exhausted men who desperately wanted the war to end. He saw the hesitation in their eyes, the way their hands hovered near their weapons without gripping them. He recognized the fear of making the wrong choice, when no good choices remained. So, Hartwell made the choice for them. He stepped forward, not with aggression or theatricality, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome. He raised one hand, palm open, and gestured toward the ground. The command was unspoken, universal, and unmistakable. Asterisk, put them down, asterisk. The lead SS officer, an Oberfuhrer whose decorations hung crookedly on a tunic, stained with sweat and grime, stared at the American, his jaw tightening. His hand drifted to his sidearm, fingers brushing the leather holster. But he did not draw. In that instant, he saw something in Hartwell's eyes that gave him pause. Not rage, not hatred, not even fear. He saw certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty that resistance was futile. Behind the officer, the column stirred. Whispers rippled from man to man in German. Was Mochter? What is he doing? Soldiers glanced over their shoulders, scanning the dense tree line, expecting the American to be the vanguard of a larger force concealed in the shadows. But there was no one else. There was only the wind, the distant thunder of artillery, and the lone figure standing in their path. Then, slowly, a soldier at the rear of the column let his rifle slip from his shoulder. It struck the ground with a muted thud, cushioned by pine needles and moss. The sound rippled through the group like a stone cast into still water. Another rifle dropped, then another. The Oberfuhrer turned, his face flushing, his mouth opening to shout an order that never came. He realized his men were no longer listening to him. They were listening to something else, to the silent promise that this, at last, was the end. That they could stop running, stop fighting, and stop pretending to believe in a cause that had led them into the heart of darkness. Within 2 minutes, 60 weapons lay scattered on the forest floor. 60 men stood with their hands raised or clasped behind their heads, their expressions a complex mixture of relief and disbelief. Hartwell did not smile, nor did he gloat. He simply nodded once and gestured for them to begin walking. They followed him through the woods, past the skeletal remains of a bombed-out farmhouse, moving toward the distant sound of American voices and the low rumble of Sherman tanks. The official after-action report, filed 3 days later by Hartwell's commanding officer, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. It notes that Private Hartwell successfully apprehended 60 enemy combatants without discharging his weapon and recommends him for commendation. It does not mention the broken rifle. It does not explore the psychological dimensions of the encounter. It does not ask the question that haunts every retelling of this story. How? Interviews conducted with some of the captured SS soldiers in the months following the war provide fragments of an answer, though they are tinged with shame and reluctance. One soldier, identified only as a member of the 12th SS Panzer Division, described a moment in halting English. Asterisk. We knew the war was finished. We knew if we shot him, more would come. But mostly, he looked at us like he understood, like he was giving us permission to stop. Asterisk. Another, interviewed by a French journalist in 1948, was more blunt. Asterisk. The American had no fear. If he was not afraid, what did that mean for us? It meant our war was already over. The rifle did not matter. What mattered was that he believed, and we did not. This was the paradox at the heart of the encounter. The SS had been trained to recognize strength, to defer to authority, and to follow the leader who displayed the most certainty. For years, that leader had been the Führer, the embodiment of national will. But by April 1945, Hitler was a raving shell in a bunker, and his promised certainty had evaporated. Into that vacuum stepped Eugene Hartwell, a farm boy from Iowa who had never fired a shot in anger, whose weapon was broken, and whose only advantage was the willingness to act as if the outcome was already decided. He became the symbolic inversion of everything the SS had been taught to revere. He was not Aryan, nor disciplined in the Prussian sense. He was simply a man who understood that power is nothing more than a collective agreement to recognize it. Hartwell himself rarely spoke of the incident. In a brief interview for a local newspaper in 1952, he downplayed his role with characteristic modesty. Asterisk. I just did what seemed right. They looked like they wanted to quit, so I gave them the chance. Nothing brave about it, just common sense. Asterisk yet. Those who served with him remembered that Hartwell carried that broken rifle for the remainder of the war, refusing to replace it even when offered a functioning weapon. He kept it as a reminder, though he never articulated of what. Some speculated it was a talisman, a symbol of the day he turned weakness into strength through sheer force of will. Others believed it was a silent rebuke, an acknowledgement that the tools of violence were less important than the courage to use or not use them. The rifle itself was never recovered. After Hartwell's discharge in late 1945, it vanished from the historical record. Rumors persist that he buried it in the woods outside his hometown, returning the wood and metal to the earth from which they were forged. But these are merely stories, fragments of myth clinging to the edges of verified fact. What is verified is this. On April 14th, 1945, in a Bavarian forest, one American soldier with a broken rifle convinced 60 members of the Waffen SS to surrender without firing a single shot. The quiet absurdity and profound simplicity of that moment captures something essential about the collapse of the Third Reich. It was not defeated solely by firepower or industrial capacity, but by the slow, inexorable erosion of belief. The SS soldiers did not surrender because they feared death. They had faced death 1,000 times. They surrendered because they no longer believed in the cause for which they were supposed to die. In that moment of clarity, when survival became the only truth, they saw in Eugene Hartwell the simple, unadorned honesty of a man offering them the dignity of surrender rather than the ignominy of slaughter. The story of the broken rifle remains a footnote, absent from blockbuster films and major documentaries, preserved only in obscure memoirs and fading memories. Yet its resonance endures. It teaches us that war is not won solely by those who fight hardest, but by those who understand when to offer an alternative. Eugene Hartwell returned to Iowa, farmed the land of his fathers, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children. He never called himself a hero, but in the hearts of 60 men who walked out of those woods in 1945, he was something more enduring. He was the man who gave them permission to survive. He was the man with the broken rifle who proved that the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that chooses not to. And in that choice, however small, however forgotten by history, lies the vast, quiet difference between tyranny and freedom, between ideology and humanity, between war and peace.